On this episode of the Up-Level Dairy Podcast, we are going over the key points that dairy producers need to know about new risk management protection tools for you as of July 1st, 2025, as we look at LRP, livestock risk protection for beef on dairy calves, as well as opportunities to protect the value of those dairy cull cows. And here to do that is Curtis Bosma from HighGround Dairy. This episode is brought to you by HighGround Dairy. HighGround Dairy provides global dairy market intelligence, insurance services, futures and options brokerage, and advisory programs to a diverse range of dairy market participants throughout the supply chain. As always, information shared in this podcast is for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities. Opinions expressed are current as of June 27th, 2025 at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time and only represent the views of the speaker and not those of HighGround Trading unless otherwise expressly noted. Curtis, we usually sit down with you once a month for a market update from HighGround Dairy, but this is a special episode that really you and I are bringing together a service to dairy producers and professionals out in the industry to better understand a topic that keeps coming up and coming up again as we really look at risk management, especially with new tools available for doing that with livestock risk protection. So Curtis, just give a little bit of an overview on this topic and why it was important to you to be able to bring this forward to our audience of dairy producers and professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole beef on dairy trend is nothing new in the dairy industry. It's been something that we've all been tracking for quite some time now. But when it comes to managing the price of that and understanding how we can mitigate the price risk that attached to cull cows or day-old beef cross calves, really wasn't that many options available to us. So I want to definitely unpack that a little bit. But I also want to take a step back and say, okay, these tools sound great, but we're kind of adding on to the pile of tools and financial things that I, as a dairy producer, need to be aware of, need to keep track of, like, how does this all function? What is sort of the importance level of all of these things? At HighGround, we believe in a complete approach to financial risk management for dairy producers. So it's not just about your milk price or your feed cost. We believe at looking at every single piece of the puzzle. We break that into really three categories, being milk, feed, and herd. And then that way our producers can really protect the overall margin that is going to be impacting their bottom line.
So really, it's about putting the pieces together, and that's what we're going to be doing today.
Yeah. So, I mean, thinking about those three categories and managing price risks on cattle and things like that, how does it all really fit in? The biggest piece of what we do with dairy producers, I would say, is mostly on the milk side. It's the largest revenue source for a dairy farm. Historically, we would have said it's 90 to 95% of revenue, but now with how elevated these beef prices are, it's more like 80 to 85% of revenue on dairy. But still, I think with that, we're helping producers understand how their milk is being priced and then putting together the correct strategies using the correct tools to be able to manage that price risk, since that is the single largest revenue item for dairy farms. Secondly, on the feed side of things, feed is a little bit more dynamic in that there's feeds that dairy farmers are growing versus feeds that they're buying. And then when it comes to feeds that they're buying, there are feeds that don't necessarily have any sort of linkage or correlation to a futures market, where there's other items that there is a direct correlation and an ability to use the futures and options markets to be able to add some dynamic flexibility in how they're essentially buying their feed. So a lot of that just comes with educating producers on how to use those tools, where they fit into the strategy. But yeah, it's a big piece, obviously, feed being the largest expense category for a dairy. And then lastly, our third component is just everything that revolves around the herd. And this is, I would say, a little bit of a new frontier in terms of what we're able to do here, because historically there really wasn't much available to dairy producers to help mitigate the price risk of cull cows or beef calves that were being sold off the farm. You could use a futures contract for those things, either from the live cattle market or the feeder cattle market, for mitigating some of those price risks, but it was complicated. There was a lot of assumptions and basis risk that you were having to stomach in those things. But now with some of these updates that are coming as of July 1st to the LRP program, we're really getting kind of a nice refreshed toolkit to be able to attack some of those financial risks.
And so, Curtis, what I'm hearing from you share today too is we're looking at these three categories of risk management. Milk is one that you spend a lot of your time in. Most producers are pretty familiar with, but still always have a learning curve. Feed is another piece of that puzzle, but this one that has been less utilized in the past, but with the changes that have been made to really serve dairy producers at a higher level coming into July 2025 here, it's this piece of LRP, livestock risk protection. And so I want to just really invite you, Curtis, to break this particular tool down into what dairy producers need to know about what it does and how it works and how they can best integrate that into an overall risk management strategy.
Yeah, so looking at the new updates to the LRP program as it pertains to dairy producers, the two kind of things that we're most excited about is the ability to protect the value of the day-old beef cross calves as well as the cull cows. So we'll talk about these separately. There's a lot of crossover pieces between the two, but first looking at calves, I think it's important to first understand that when everyone's selling these day-old beef cross calves and you're hearing some of these price levels of, it was exciting when we started to hear that we got close to $1,000. Now it's close to $1,200 or $1,300 per head for what people are getting paid for these animals at these crazy record high beef prices. Those are all really exciting things, and I think dairy producers have obviously understood the significance that this has brought to the revenue side of the equation for their operations. But where are those numbers coming from? Where is that day-old value derived from? I think it's exciting to see it at these levels, but it's also important, I think, to understand some of the math behind how that's being calculated. So what all of that is based upon. So if you're selling a day-old calf to a calf buyer, chances are whoever's buying that calf is raising it to a higher weight, whether it's 400 pounds or taking it all the way to 800 pounds or something like that before selling it to a feedlot for finishing. And the price level they're looking at there is essentially the feeder cattle market. So they're using the feeder cattle futures contract and looking at that to figure out what the future value of those animals are going to be. But now the feeder cattle futures at the CME are all it's a cash settled futures contract. So it's based upon the CME feeder cattle index, which is essentially just they take all of these auction facilities that are registered with the USDA. They take the weighted average price on a 7-day rolling average for what the 700 to 900 pound animals are selling for. So they're taking essentially those steer values. And then that's our cash market index, or our price that those animals are going to be valued off of. Now the futures market is essentially trading off of that cash market value and moving up and down and allowing people to transfer future risk of what that index is going to be. But the calf buyers are looking at that. They know exactly their metrics internally of at what rate are these animals going to gain weight, how much is it going to cost them to put that weight on the animals, and they're tracking those things to essentially figure out their margin for what these things are doing. And we've actually seen a number of dairy producers get into this game a little bit of retaining ownership of their beef cross calves, taking them to 400 pounds or so, and then marketing them from that weight. So I would say those producers are becoming much more familiar with some of those terms and things like that. But I think the main component there to understand is that day-old value is essentially based upon that. It's someone reversing out the math to figure out, okay, how much does it cost us to take this day-old calf to the next weight where we intend to sell it? What's going to be the value of that animal based on the feeder cattle futures market? And then what is our margin or our price risk at those levels? And then essentially work that backwards. And that's how these numbers are being determined.
When we look at LRP, it's that day-old calf that we're protecting the price on. If you're someone who has retained calves for a certain period of time to a certain weight, to 400 pounds or whatever it is, that's not for them. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. The existing LRP program, before we add in the calf component of it, actually pretty much exists for that purpose. It allows people taking animals to a higher weight category to protect the value of that. So for those producers that are retaining ownership and taking those animals to 400 pounds or so, right now the program currently functions, even before these updates, to meet that need of being able to protect that price risk at those weights. What the new updates are for is, because the existing program really only allows people to secure animals that are over a certain weight. So it's designed more for those heavier animals, 400 pounds all the way up to fed out cattle and everything like that, up to 1,600 pounds. Because the day old calves, like a day old Holstein Angus cross, is 80, 85 pounds, it's not big enough really to be able to secure that value. And when you look at sort of the pricing of how that's being functioned out, is we could look at the market and say like, hey, the feeder cattle futures are at $300 a hundredweight, but in reality, I'm getting paid like $1,300 or $1,400 per hundredweight for those day old calves. So there's a little bit of a difference there. So that's where these updates to the LRP program are quite advantageous, because the way that it functions essentially is they're coming up with an expected per hundredweight price for those day old calves. And it's based off a dynamic price adjustment factor. So that dynamic price adjustment factor is essentially taking into account what the valuation of those calves are, kind of based on a couple different various data sources, but ultimately getting it to a point where we're looking at a multiple of what is the feeder cattle index and what do we have to multiply that by to be able to arrive at a value that is relatively close to what the per hundredweight value of those day old calves are going to be. So early indications have suggested that multiple, or that price adjustment factor, it's going to vary. Of course, it's dynamic, but early suggestions have been that it's going to be somewhere in that 400 to 450%. So that would mean essentially if we're at a $300 per hundredweight feeder cattle futures price and we have a 400% price adjustment factor, that our reference price per hundredweight would essentially be $1,200. So that gives us a pretty good number to work off of with that. And then essentially the way the coverage works is it's on a per head basis. And so no matter how many you're selling, whether it's 5 head a month or 500 head a month off of a dairy facility, you can cover it on a per head basis, declare that targeted marketing weight of, hey, I sell 150 a month. They're going to be on average 85 pounds. Then we can look at that dynamic price adjustment factor, look at where the feeder cattle futures market is going to be, because these offers for LRP are daily and it's based off of the settlement price of the feeder cattle futures market. And then from that expected price, we can essentially choose a coverage level to establish a price floor. So coverage levels go all the way up to 100%. So you can essentially cover at the market values. And then they go much lower than that as well. But those price floors are, since this is a federal crop insurance program, they're going to be subsidized as well, so quite price competitive. And considering how much of the overall revenue this has become for dairy producers, we're kind of simplifying this for people and saying, hey, we're just taking into account rough monthly average of how many head per month that you're going to be marketing and coming up with essentially a forward price projection for those, and then being able to secure some of that value going forward. Because right now we're at this really awesome kind of area where we were at record high beef prices as of a week or two ago, but now prices have come off a little bit. We're recovering a bit today in the market, but at these price levels, that's a significant amount of value that's able to be captured. And we are happy with all these numbers. And when we look at the market insights that our team's tracking closely as well, with the super tight overall cattle inventory in the US and all the placements that are taking place, there's not necessarily anything on the horizon that's screaming like, oh my goodness, this market's going to jump off a cliff. But at some point, if we do rebuild this herd and we do get to a point where that beef market does soften up to a significant factor, whether that's supply driven from the herd regrowth or whether that's from a demand loss where we run into some economic issues and consumers just aren't eating beef the way that they currently are, then we're going to see that market take a bit of a dive lower. And being able to protect that value of those day-old calves, especially since that's become a significant revenue source for dairies, I would say is super important to think, again, if we're going back to our complete risk management solution here, we want to make sure that those values are being captured when markets are presenting opportunities.
Curtis, when we look at the calves that this program applies to, I want to just really lay out which calves that could be. So across the board in the industry, we've got beef on dairy females. We have obviously beef on dairy males. But when I say beef on dairy, that can be a lot of different breed combinations. It can be a Holstein cross, it can be a Jersey cross, it can be anything in between. And so which calves count for this program?
Yeah, another excellent question. So when looking at the specific things that you can cover under the calf protection through LRP, it's anything that is crossbred with a predominantly beef breed. So that can fall under a lot of categories because you've got essentially majority of dairy cows in the US are either Holstein or Jersey, in which case you're crossbreeding with an Angus or a Charolais or a Wagyu, or there's lots of different combinations of how that's being done. But as long as it's one of those predominantly beef breeds that are being crossbred in, all of those are eligible for coverage under that LRP calf pricing. Now, the price of those day olds in the cash market may be a little bit different because obviously the price that a Holstein Wagyu or Holstein Angus cross brings versus maybe a Jersey Charolais or something like that, there's going to be a bit of a price differential between those in the actual marketplace. But again, all of those are going to be influenced by that feeder cattle index and that feeder cattle futures market, which is driving those prices. So the reference price that you may be covering may say that, hey, I'm securing $1,000 a head or $1,100 a head. But if you're selling one of those Jersey crosses, the reality is that animal's probably going at a little bit of a discount to whatever that feeder cattle index is portraying out there. So it doesn't tie in quite perfectly, but if that market does drop, it's going to have also a drop on the value of those Jersey crosses as well. So all those things are encompassed in that. And then on those straight breds, so Holstein steers, things like that, there is an LRP option to be able to secure the value of Holstein steers, but it does not apply to the calves. It goes to a higher weight. So if you're taking those to 300, 400 pounds, you can protect the value of those. The only thing I will say is that the price adjustment factor for the Holstein steers at the higher weights is a bit lower. So in that case, they're taking whatever the feeder cattle market is and then multiplying it by a factor of 50%. So you're really not getting a ton of value out of those. And I mean, right now with these elevated beef prices, the basis between where a Holstein steer is trading for and an Angus steer is like tighter than it's been in quite a while. But that is not really a consistent relationship. So that's why that price adjustment factor is not quite as advantageous.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Curtis, we've been talking about this new program for calves and beef on dairy calves, as you just specified and really set out these definitions for. But there's also coverage that is now available for cull cows. So this is something else that is new, a new tool available for dairy producers is this cull cow coverage. So let's go there. Explain a little bit about what the programs are, how they're working, and who they're for.
Yeah, so a lot of crossover between the calf LRP pricing option and the cull cow, but there's a few key differences to highlight. So first, and the biggest one really, is that the cull cows are not going to be based off of the feeder cattle market. It's going to be based off of the live cattle market. So the live cattle market functions a little bit differently, whereas the price discovery for the feeders, as we talked about, was kind of that weighted average price of all those auctions that are reporting. On the live cattle side, they do take like a 5 area average of what those finished cattle are selling for. And then that's kind of your ultimate reference price, which the CME live cattle futures are going to trade off of as well. But then the price adjustment factor is also going to be somewhat dynamic to that price point for the cull cows. And early indications have suggested that's going to be around 50% of that, since there is quite a bit of a big yield difference between maybe a beef bred animal and a dairy cull cow. They do reduce that value down. So that's a pretty big difference in how much value you're able to capture out of something like that. The other piece of the cull cow option is that it only goes up to 13 weeks into the future. So it's roughly 3 months that you're able to go out to secure coverage. Whereas on the calf side of things, if you're protecting those, you can technically go up to 52 weeks or a year out into the future, which gives you a lot more proactivity. I mean, obviously, you're going to know 8 to 9 months in the future of how many beef cross calves you're expecting in the pipeline to be able to secure coverage of the value of those animals. But on the cull cow side, we're not able to go out quite as far. And I think that's maybe something that gets adjusted into the future. But because there's less proactivity with that program, maybe not quite as lucrative for producers, because like we were saying earlier, if this beef market is facing some potential headwinds on the horizon and we do see a bit of a price drop, we're going to want to have coverage going out as far as we can to secure as much of that value. And on the cull cow side, we really don't have all that much flexibility with only 13 weeks of coverage horizon.
So then when you really look at who's the best candidate for these programs, especially this cull cow piece, who is this for? Who is the ideal dairy producer candidate to take advantage of a program like this?
Yeah, so I would say this would apply to pretty much every dairy producer would benefit from these things. Again, I want to take that step back and talk about, we want to make sure when we're presenting these things to producers and talking about the benefits of this, that we're tying this into a complete solution. This is not just, hey, we're going to cover all these calves, but then we're going to do nothing to make sure that we're protecting ourselves on feed or milk. This is, of the three items that we outlaid of feed, milk, and herd, right now, talking about the herd stuff is really exciting because we're at these near record high beef prices and we see a lot of potential for tools like this. But when you look at an income statement for a dairy, we also have to recognize that the largest issues are our milk and our feed. And those are going to determine the financial outcome of everything from a pretty big perspective there. So I want to make sure we don't lose sight of how we're looking at this completely. But I also want to make sure that, hey, we're taking into account this is part of the puzzle now. And these are solutions that we're going to want to implement into a complete risk management solution. The question I get most common in having these conversations, and I think the honest response you get from a lot of producers is, how am I going to have the time to manage an additional thing now? Because you're just adding to the pile of things that I have to think about, markets that I have to track, things that I'm looking into. And I get it. It's a lot when you consider, hey, there's a lot of complex systems that need a lot of attention on the dairy farm that can chew up all of our time. And I think to that, we really want to make sure that if producers are having those concerns and want to just kind of say, hey, can someone just help me drive the bus on this stuff? That's where we come in and serve as more of an advisory role where, hey, we'll take a couple of your production data points, help you put together a plan. And we've seen from the commercial end of the business and from the producers as well that there's a benefit to having a plan and having an approach for all of these things and having somebody on your team where the incentives are aligned. We're not just trying to sell you another insurance policy. We're trying to help you take a look at this complete solution and tie everything together. So for people that are listening to this and having that initial response of like, oh boy, here we go, another thing that I have to think about, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll help you put a plan together for this stuff.
That's right. And a plan that incorporates those three prongs that you've been talking about, integrating together into that bigger picture of protecting milk, protecting feed price, and then also protecting these opportunities to make additional income off of herd through sales of those beef on dairy calves and also through cull cows. And as always, Curtis, your contact information is in our show notes for those that would like to reach out and to take the burden off of their own plate of not only trying to manage this whole thing, but trying to learn it and figure out a new system, figure out a new government program to be able to just rely on people like you that do it every day. And Curtis, any other final thoughts you'd like to add as we wrap up this conversation?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that producers that are seeking that help and are looking at all these things know this stuff. I always look at this, we're not necessarily trying to sell a product or sell a service, but we're just trying to educate people. And when the light bulb goes off and you see the value and you can take that step back from the business and say, hey, these are great opportunities to be able to secure our financial future, get this clarity so that we can continue to do what we love to do, then I think those are great things. I have been joking a lot lately with people that the environmental movement has stolen the word sustainability from us. And they use it as a term to say, hey, when you're being sustainable, you're doing something that's good for the environment. But in reality, in agriculture, I think sustainability is just keeping everything in motion for the long haul. And that's a challenge in and of itself. And with that, our mission is always just to provide that financial clarity. And then through tools like this, be able to control our financial outcomes into the future.
And as always, Curtis, thanks for jumping on with us to share your knowledge in these areas on this special episode and update from HighGround Dairy outside of our monthly market report, which our listeners can look forward to listening to every month, dropping right after the 15th of the month. And so you'll be back on with us again soon to share some more of these insights on what's been going on in the markets. But thank you today for shedding a light and providing this FYI on LRP and other risk management programs for dairy producers. You just heard from Curtis Bosma with HighGround Dairy as we've explored livestock risk protection programs for both beef on dairy calves and for dairy cull cows. If you'd like more information on these topics, make sure to reach out to HighGround Dairy and find those links in the show notes. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and until next time, keep on growing, keep on learning, and up-leveling your dairy.